Want to check out a great new shirtwaist pattern and learn a bit about what goes into the process of pattern testing? I'm Shannon Makes, historical costumer by day, professional athlete by night, and that is exactly what we'll be doing in this week's video. The pattern in question, a super cute history-bounding pattern waist by the lovely and talented Lina Piprek, freelance clothing maker and professional coffee addict. I'm sure you know who she is. She's been around for far longer than I have, and I'll be sure to link her channel in the description for easy access. She put out a call amongst several of us costubers asking for pattern testers in a wide variety of sizes and body shapes, and several of us answered the call, which means that I'll be joined in good company by Miss Philomena, Angela of Demi Pint Creations, and Opus Eleni. The first step was to download the pattern, the instructions, and to get the materials required. Now, normally I would be seriously tempted to go digging around in my stash for some crazy secondhand material, but for this project, I specifically wanted to be able to give feedback about the yardage that I used and how it compared to what was recommended. So I started off with a trip to my local fabric shop where I beelined for the zero waste section where you can buy end of roll fabric remnants for a heavy discount. After some serious scrounging, I came away with this lovely cotton fabric, which was not only a super cute acorn print perfect for the season, but was also labeled as being exactly the 2 meters of fabric that this pattern called for. I also picked up this lace in a dusty robin's egg blue that perfectly matched the print of the cotton. The rest of the notions, buttons, and twill tape came from my stash. The first step is one that many of us will recognize, and that's printing off and cutting out the pattern. And this was one of the steps that Lina specifically asked for feedback on. So I made sure to carefully read the instructions all the way through and follow them to the letter in order to give accurate feedback. It was pretty straightforward though, and things went together without a hitch. Little things like hiccups in the cutting line were photographed and noted for a final assessment at the end of the process. Then, naturally, I washed and ironed my fabric, but before I laid out my pattern pieces, I double-checked that the yardage listed was what I actually received. Was this strictly necessary? No, but again, I wanted to be able to give constructive feedback on the amount of fabric needed, and so I wanted to be sure that I was actually working with 2 meters. The instructions came with a note stating that the fabric yardages and layouts were not yet finalized for all views and sizes. This pattern has 3 different styling options, so I was free to lay out the pieces however I preferred, which I did, and then I took a couple photos of the layout I ended up with, just for future reference. One thing that I did note was that some of the pattern pieces didn't have any grain lines marked on them, and while that didn't bother me because I could just infer the grain line, I did make a note to mention it to Lina because I thought it might throw off less advanced sewists. Then the pattern pieces could be cut out. Now, every person and company probably has their own slightly unique pattern testing process. In this case, Lina is including this pattern in her upcoming book of history-bounding patterns, meant to help individuals create their own capsule wardrobe with staple pieces that can be easily mixed and matched. Besides being an interesting factoid, that also means that the format of her instructions are somewhat unique, because there are many aspects of the basic sewing process, such as various seam and hem finishes, that she'll cover in previous chapters in her book, meaning that they weren't necessarily included in our instructions for the shirtwaist. In our case, we're all fairly experienced sewists, so the lack of instructions on how to finish our seams didn't trip us up, although I did have to ask for some tips on how to make better looking thread loops, since that was a first for me. Within the first page of the instructions were some key points that Lina was specifically looking for feedback on. These were helpful to know up front, so we could give her the most useful and targeted feedback on areas of her pattern that she had the most questions or concerns about, although of course she welcomed other feedback as well. With the pieces all cut out, I started on the assembly process, the first step of which was to carefully mark out and sew up all of the pintucks. Another point that Lina specifically asked us to pay attention to as we worked our way through the project was how well the shirtwaist went together. Were the seams the same length? Did the notches line up? Etc. So I kept that in the back of my mind throughout the assembly process. For me, this was my first time sewing pintucks, and so I thought that I would mark them out very carefully, following her directions, but then taking it even a little bit further just to make sure I could sew them cleanly. Her pattern has the pintucks very clearly marked out, and the instructions, which were accompanied by photos, were very clear and easy to follow, so I had absolutely no one else to blame but myself when I realized that I had painstakingly marked all of my pintucks on the good side of the fabric. So I needed to transfer the markings to the back, but at this point I was at work and I didn't have the pattern on hand, so rather than lose a full day of sewing, I just used what I had at my disposal, namely a window and a couple hours of daylight, to transfer the markings over to the back of the fabric and then sew the pintucks up. The next step was going to involve working with the insertion lace, which in my case had this unfortunate elastic thread running through the top edge. I bought it hoping that I could carefully pick out the elastic without destroying the rest of the lace, and fortunately this proved to be the case, but it was a long, slow process and I didn't bother filming much of it. With my lace finally able to lie flat, I could pin it onto the yoke, and you can see me here continually referencing the instructions to make sure that I understood how to turn the corners properly. This required a ton of pins, and it was the first time that I kind of thought about how the weave of my lace was affecting the process. I chose this lace because the color was perfect, but I didn't even consider the scale of the weave, and it just happened to be that this lace had a really large, loose weave, which made it trickier to work with than if it had been a more traditional Edwardian style lace with a much smaller, tighter weave. As it was, my lace wanted to keep shifting out of alignment, so I had to be careful as I sewed it up to keep everything straight. And if I didn't even consider this aspect when purchasing the lace, I figured it might be worth mentioning to Lina in case she wanted to put a note in her book about what to look for when choosing insertion laces. The mitered edges of the lace were then stitched down by hand, again following the instructions provided, and already it was starting to look like something quite promising. Then the pins were removed as I basted the lace into place before sewing it with the machine. Again, doing a bit more intense basting job than I might otherwise have done with a tighter weave of lace. This pattern is nice and voluminous, and part of that is due to these cute little gathers on the bottom section of the back. It's a subtle touch, but it gives a very nice effect. Once all the insertion lace was sewn and the yokes were no longer free-floating, it was time to sew up the blouse, and I had the idea that I wanted to do this with French seams. It would be my first time doing them, but the instructions at this point seemed to direct me towards a more classic serged or felled finish, so I quickly checked in with Lina to see if French seams would be okay, or if she'd prefer that I stuck to the instructions for this one. She very enthusiastically encouraged me to finish the seams how I wanted, as that technique would in fact be included in prior chapters, and finishing the seams however I wanted would also be very much in keeping with the spirit of her book, so that's exactly what I did. Now, I don't know if you noticed from some of the previous shots of this pattern, but the front especially is very voluminous, and that's because there's a drawstring included in the pattern that sits right on the waistline to gather it all in, and so the next step was to attach the casing for it. And here's where I accidentally went off script a little bit. Lina included instructions for how to attach the drawstring for either a center front or a center back opening, and I decided that I definitely wanted access in the front, so I attached the casing and the drawstring in the way that I thought was most logical, without necessarily reading the instructions verbatim at this point, which ended up being not quite how Lina intended the process to go, although it may have been a fortuitous mistake. Next, plackets were added to the sleeves in order to have that nice tight button-up cuff that is such an iconic Edwardian look. Then the sleeves were sewn up, and gathering stitches were sewn in to eventually help gather the sleeves down into the cuffs. These were made by cutting out 8, yes, I repeat, 8 of these little cuff pieces, which were then sewn together so that I ended up with 2 cuffs, each of which had an inner and outer layer. This allowed the gathered down sleeve to be sandwiched in between these two, where it was then stitched by hand. Off camera. Because at this point I was running a bit behind schedule and I really needed to prioritize finishing the shirt over filming it. Fortunately, at this point the shirtwaist was nearly finished. Buttons and buttonholes were sewn in at work, and the collar, which ended up being the only part of the pattern that didn't precisely line up, was inserted after a few choice words and a bit of trimming to the neckline of the front yoke. Then, celebratory photos were sent to Lina and the rest of the pattern testers, at which point Lina politely pointed out that I had somehow managed to attach the sleeves on the wrong sides, even after she had clarified which way they went. But, you know, it still looks great, and because the blouse is fairly loose, it doesn't pull oddly, so nobody'll know. Then, the last stage of the process was to give thoughts and feedback, which is where I took all of my notes, compiled over the entire process, and shared them with Lina for her to ruminate on and decide if parts of the pattern or the instructions need to be tweaked. My notes included things as small and minor as those tiny pattern hiccups and the question of the grain line markings, to things that were a bit more intricate, like how I did my waistband and the order of operations for the collar. The way I did my waistband, for example, was not really how she had envisioned the front closing waistband working, but it turns out that it was also the way that Miss Philomena did hers, and that it's great for accessibility because you can fully open and close the back buttons if desired, and you don't have to try to tie a knot behind your back. So the final pattern might actually reflect my method of doing it, which made me feel like a useful contributing member of the pattern testing team, so yay! It was also really interesting to see feedback from everyone else. The choices they decided to make, the hiccups they ran into, often similar to mine, and the assessments that they made. All in all, I absolutely love this pattern. Clearly, since I turned around and immediately remade it for my tacky Cuban Pete Gunny Saxoine mashup that I released last week. It absolutely achieves the goal of being a history-bounding wardrobe staple. It comes in an amazing range of sizes, and it's got a hint of the high-necked Edwardian collar without actually being tight or high for those who really don't like things touching their neck. If you want to see the flip side of this process, pop on over to Lina's page for a behind-the-scene looks at the making of this pattern. Or otherwise, check out how I repurposed this very same pattern into tacky Cuban Pete here.